One of the newest and fleetest of the patrol vessels of the Triplanetary League, the heavy cruiser Chicago of the North American Division of the Tellurian contingent, plunged stolidly through interplanetary vacuum. For 5 long weeks she had patrolled her allotted volume of space. In another week she would report back to the city whose name she bore, where her space-weary crew, worn by their long tour in the awesomely oppressive depths of the limitless void, would enjoy to the full their fortnight of refreshing planetary leave. She was performing certain routine tasks, charting meteorites, watching for derelicts and other obstructions to navigation, checking in constantly with all scheduled spaceships in case of need, and so on. But primarily she was a warship. She was a mighty engine of destruction, hunting for the unauthorized vessels of whatever power or planet it was that had not only defied the Triplanetary League, but was evidently attempting to overthrow it, attempting to plunge the 3 planets back into the ghastly sink of bloodshed and destruction from which they had so recently emerged. Every spaceship within range of her powerful detectors was represented by 2 brilliant, slowly moving points of light, one upon a greater micrometer screen, the other in the tank, the immense 3-dimensional, minutely cubed model of the entire solar system. A brilliantly intense red light flared upon a panel, and a bell clanged brazenly the furious signals of the sector alarm. Simultaneously, a speaker roared forth its message of a ship in dire peril. "Sector alarm, NAT Hyperion, gassed with V2, nothing detectable in space but—" The half-uttered message was drowned out in a crackling roar of meaningless noise. The orderly signals of the bell became a hideous clamor, and the 2 points of light which had marked the location of the liner disappeared in widely spreading flashes of the same high-powered interference. Observers, navigators, and control officers were alike dumbfounded. Even the captain, in the shell-proof, shock-proof, and doubly ray-proof retreat of his conning compartment, was equally at a loss. No ship or thing could possibly be close enough to be sending out interfering waves of such tremendous power, yet there they were. "Maximum acceleration straight for the point where the Hyperion was when her tracers went out," the captain ordered, and through the fringe of that widespread interference he drove a solid beam, reporting concisely to GHQ. Almost instantly the emergency call-out came roaring in. Every vessel of the sector, of whatever class or tonnage, was to concentrate upon the point in space where the ill-fated liner had last been known to be. Hour after hour, the great globe drove on at maximum acceleration, captain and every control officer alert and at high tension. But in the quartermaster's department, deep down below the generator rooms, no thought was given to such minor matters as the disappearance of a Hyperion. The inventory did not balance, and 2 QM privates were trying, profanely and without success, to find the discrepancy. "Charge calls from R12 Lewistons, none requisitioned, on hand 18,000... The droning voice broke off short in the middle of a word, and the private stood rigid, in the act of reaching for another slip, every faculty concentrated upon something imperceptible to his companion. "Come on, Cleve, snap it up," the second commanded, but was silenced by a vicious wave of the listener's hand. "What?" the rigid one exclaimed. "Reveal ourselves? Why, it's... Oh, all right. Oh, that's it. I see. Yes, I've got it solid. So long." The inventory sheets fell unheeded from his hand, and his fellow private stared after him in amazement as he strode over to the desk of the officer in charge. That officer also stared as the hitherto easygoing and gold-bricking Cleve saluted crisply, showed him something flat in the palm of his left hand, and spoke. "I've just got some of the funniest orders ever put out, Lieutenant, but they came from way, way up. I'm to join the brass hats in the center. You'll know about it directly, I imagine. Cover me up as much as you can, will you?" And he was gone. Unchallenged, he made his way to the control room, and his curt, "Urgent report for the captain," admitted him there without question. But when he approached the sacred precincts of the captain's own and inviolate room, he was stopped, in no uncertain fashion, by no less a personage than the officer of the day. "And report yourself under arrest immediately," the O.D. concluded his brief but pointed speech. "You were right in stopping me, of course," the intruder conceded, unmoved. "I wanted to get in there without giving everything away if possible, but it seems that I can't. Well, I've been ordered by Virgil Samms to report to the captain at once. See this? Touch it." He held out a flat, insulated disk, cover thrown back to reveal a tiny golden meteor, at the sight of which the officer's truculent manner altered markedly. "I have heard of them, of course, but I never saw one before," and the officer touched the shining symbol lightly with his finger, jerking backward as there shot through his whole body a tingling surge of power, shouting into his very bones an unpronounceable syllable, the password of the Triplanetary service. "Genuine or not, it gets you to the captain. He'll know, and if it's a fake, you'll be breathing space in 5 minutes." Projector at the ready, the officer of the day followed Cleve into the Holy of Holies. There the grizzled four-striper touched the golden meteor lightly, then drove his piercing gaze deep into the unflinching eyes of the younger man. But that captain had won his high rank neither by accident nor by pull. He understood at once. "It must be an emergency," he growled half-audibly, still staring at his lowly QM clerk, "to make Sam's uncover this way." He turned and curtly dismissed the wondering OD, then, "All right, out with it. Serious enough so that every one of us afloat has just received orders to reveal himself to his commanding officer, and to anyone else, if necessary, to reach that officer at once. Orders never before issued. The enemy have been located. They have built a base, and have ships better than our best. Base and ships cannot be seen or detected by any ether wave. However, the service has been experimenting for years with a new type of communicator beam, and while pretty crude yet, it was given to us when the Dione went out without leaving a trace. One of our men was in the Hyperion, managed to stay alive, and has been sending data. I am instructed to attach my new phone set to one of the universal plates in your conning room and to see what I can find." "Go to it." The captain waved his hand, and the operative bent to his task. "Commanders of all vessels of the fleet," the headquarters speaker, received sealed upon the wavelength of the admiral of the fleet, broke the long silence. "All vessels in sectors L to R, inclusive, will interlock location signals. Some of you have received or will receive shortly certain communications from sources which need not be mentioned. These commanders will at once send out red K4 screens. Vessels so marked will act as temporary flagships. Unmarked vessels will proceed at maximum to the nearest flagship, grouping about it in the regulation squadron cone in order of arrival. Squadrons most distant from objective point designated by flagship observers will proceed toward it at maximum. Squadrons nearest it will decelerate or reverse velocity. That point must not be approached until full fleet formation has been accomplished. Heavy and light cruisers of all other sectors inside the orbit of Mars," the orders went on, directing the mobilization of the stupendous forces of the League, so that they would be in readiness in the highly improbable event of the failure of the massed power of 7 sectors to reduce the pirate base. In those 7 sectors, perhaps a dozen vessels threw out enormous spherical screens of intense red light, and as they did so, their tracer points upon all the interlocked lookout plates also became ringed about with red. Toward those crimson markers the pilots of the unmarked vessels directed their courses at their utmost power, and while the white lights upon the lookout plates moved slowly toward and clustered about the red ones, the ultra instruments of the service operatives were probing into space, sweeping the neighborhood of the computed position of the pirates' stronghold. But the object sought was so far away that the small spy-ray sets of the service men, intended as they were for close-range work, were unable to make contact with the invisible planetoid for which they were seeking. In the captain's sanctum of the Chicago, the operative studied his plate for only a minute or two, then shut off his power and fell into a brown study, from which he was rudely aroused. "Aren't you even going to try to find them?" demanded the captain. "No," Cleve returned shortly. "No use. Not half enough power or control. I'm trying to think. Maybe... Say, Captain, will you please have the chief electrician and a couple of radio men come in here?" They came, and for hours, while the other ultra-wave men searched the apparently empty ether with their ineffective beams, the 3 technical experts and the erstwhile quartermaster's clerk labored upon a huge and complex ultra-wave projector. The 3 blindly and with doubtful questions, the one with sure knowledge at least of what he was trying to do. Finally the thing was done. The crude but efficient graduated circles were set, and the tubes glowed redly as their massed output drove into a tight beam of ultra-vibration. "There it is, sir." Cleve reported after some 10 minutes of manipulation, and the vast structure of the miniature world flashed into being upon his plate. You may notify the fleet. Coordinates H11.62, RA124-31-16, and DX about 173.2. The report made, and the assistants out of the room, the captain turned to the observer and saluted gravely. "We have always known, sir, that the service had men, but I had no idea that any one man could possibly do, on the spur of the moment, what you have just done, unless that man happens to be Lyman Cleveland." "Oh, it doesn't—" the observer began, but broke off, muttering unintelligibly at intervals, then swung the Visi-ray beam toward the earth. Soon a face appeared upon the plate, the keen but careworn face of Virgil Samms. "Hello, Lyman." His voice came clearly from the speaker, and the captain gasped. His ultra-wave observer and sometime clerk was Lyman Cleveland himself, probably the greatest living expert in beam transmission. "I knew that you'd do something if it could be done. How about it? Can the others install similar sets on their ships? I'm betting that they can't." "Probably not." Cleveland frowned in thought. "This is a patchwork affair, made of gunny sacks and haywire. I'm holding it together by main strength and awkwardness, and even at that, it's apt to go to pieces any minute. Can you rig it up for photography?" "I think so. Just a minute." "Yes, I can. Why?" "Because there's something going on out there that neither we nor apparently the pirates know anything about. The Admiralty seems to think that it's the Jovians again, but we don't see how it can be. If it is, they have developed a lot of stuff that none of our agents has even suspected." And he recounted briefly what Costigan had reported to him, concluding, "Then there was a burst of interference, on the ultraband, mind you, and I've heard nothing from him since. Therefore I want you to stay out of the battle entirely. Stay as far away from it as you can, and still get good pictures of everything that happens. I will see that orders are issued to the Chicago to that effect." "But listen—" "Those are orders," snapped Samms. "It is of the utmost importance that we know every detail of what is going to happen. The answer is pictures. The only possibility of obtaining pictures is that machine you have just developed. If the fleet wins, nothing will be lost. If the fleet loses, and I am not half as confident of success as the Admiral is, the Chicago doesn't carry enough power to decide the issue, and we will have the pictures to study, which is all important. Besides, we have probably lost Conway Costigan today, and we don't want to lose you, too." Cleveland remained silent, pondering this startling news, but the grizzled captain, veteran of the Fourth Jovian War that he was not convinced. "We'll blow them out of space, Mr. Samms," he declared. "You just think you will, Captain. I have suggested, as forcibly as possible, that the general attack be withheld until after a thorough investigation is made, but the Admiralty will not listen. They see the advisability of withdrawing a camera ship, but that is as far as they will go." "And that's plenty far enough," growled the Chicago's commander, as the beam snapped off. "Mr. Cleveland, I don't like the idea of running away under fire, and I won't do it without direct orders from the Admiral." "Of course you won't. That's why you are going—" He was interrupted by a voice from the headquarters speaker. The captain stepped up to the plate, and upon being recognized, he received the exact orders which had been requested by the chief of the Triplanetary service. Thus it was that the Chicago reversed her acceleration, cut off her red screen, and fell rapidly behind, while the vessels following her shot away toward another crimson flaring loader. Farther and farther back she dropped, back to the limiting range of the mechanism upon which Cleveland and his highly trained assistants were hard at work. And during all this time the forces of the 7 sectors had been concentrating. The pilot vessels with their flaming red screens, each followed by a cone of spaceships, drew closer and closer together, approaching the Fearless, the British super-dreadnought which was to be the flagship of the fleet, the mightiest and heaviest spaceship which had yet lifted her stupendous mass into the ether. Now, systematically and precisely, the great cone of battle was coming into being, a formation developed during the Jovian Wars, while the forces of the 3 planets were fighting in space for their very civilization's existence, and one never used since the last space fleets of Jupiter's murderous hordes had been wiped out. The mouth of that enormous hollow cone was a ring of scout patrols, the smallest and most agile vessels of the fleet. Behind them came a somewhat smaller ring of light cruisers, then rings of heavy cruisers and of light battleships, and finally of heavy battleships. At the apex of the cone, protected by all the other vessels of the formation, and in best position to direct the battle, was the flagship. In this formation, every vessel was free to use her every weapon with a minimum of danger to her sister ships. And yet, when the gigantic main projectors were operated along the axis of the formation, from the entire vast circle of the cone's mouth there flamed a cylindrical field of force of such intolerable intensity that in it no conceivable substance could endure for a moment. The artificial planet of metal was now close enough so that it was visible to the ultravision of the servicemen, so plainly visible that the cigar-shaped warships of the pirates were seen issuing from the enormous airlocks. As each vessel shot out into space, it sped straight for the approaching fleet without waiting to go into any formation. Gray Roger believed his structures invisible to triplanetary eyes, thought that the very presence of the fleet was the result of mathematical calculations, and was convinced that his mighty vessels of the void would destroy even that vast fleet without themselves becoming known. He was wrong. The foremost vessels were allowed actually to enter the mouth of that conical trap before an offensive move was made. Then the vice admiral in command of the fleet touched a button, and simultaneously every generator in every triplanetary vessel burst into furious activity. Instantly, the hollow volume of the immense cone became a coruscating hell of resistless energy, an inferno which, with the velocity of light, extended itself into a far-reaching cylinder of rapacious destruction. Ether waves they were, it is true, but vibrations driven with such fierce intensity that the screens of deflection surrounding the pirate ships could not handle even a fraction of their awful power. Invisibility lost, their defensive screens flared briefly, but even the enormous force backing Roger's inventions, far greater than that of any single triplanetary vessel, could not hold off the incredible violence of the massed attack of the hundreds of mighty vessels composing the fleet. Their defensive screens flared briefly, then went down, their great holes first glowing red, then shining white, then in a brief moment exploding into flying masses of red-hot, molten, and gaseous metal. A full 2/3 of Rogers's force was caught in that raging incandescent beam, caught and obliterated. But the remainder did not retreat to the planetoid. Darting out around the edge of the cone at a stupendous acceleration, they attacked its flanks, and the engagement became general. But now, since enough beams were kept upon each ship of the enemy so that invisibility could not be restored, each triplanetary war vessel could attack with full efficiency. Magnesium flares and star shells illuminated space for 1,000 miles. And from every unit of both fleets was being hurled every item of solid, explosive, and vibratory destruction known to the warfare of that age. Offensive beams, rods, and daggers of frightful power struck and were neutralized by defensive screens equally capable. The long-range and furious dodging made ordinary solid or even atomic explosive projectiles useless, and both sides were filling all space with such a volume of blanketing frequencies that such radio-dirigible atomics as were launched could not be controlled, but darted madly and erratically hither and thither, finally to be exploded or volatilized harmlessly in mid-space by the touch of some fiercely insistent probing beam of force. Individually, however, the pirate vessels were far more powerful than those of the fleet, and that superiority soon began to make itself felt. The power of the smaller ships began to fail as their accumulators became discharged under the awful drain of the battle, and vessel after vessel of the triplanetary fleet was hurled into nothingness by the concentrated blasts of the pirates' rays. But the triplanetary forces had one great advantage. In furious haste, the servicemen had been altering the controls of the dirigible atomic torpedoes so that they would respond to ultra-wave control, and few in number though they were, each was highly effective. A hard-eyed observer, face almost against his plate and both hands and feet manipulating controls, hurled the first torpedo. Propelling rockets viciously aflame, it twisted and looped around the incandescent rods of destruction so thickly and starkly outlined, under perfect control, unaffected by the hideous distortion of all ether-borne signals. Through a pirate screen it went, and under the terrific blast of its detonation, the entire midsection of the stricken battleship vanished. It should have been out cold, but, to the amazement of the observers, both ends kept on fighting with scarcely lessened power. 2 more of the frightful bombs had to be launched. Each remaining section had to be blown to bits before those terrible beams went out. Not a man in that great fleet had even an inkling of the truth, that those great vessels, those awful engines of destruction, did not contain a single living creature, that they were manned and fought by automatons, robots controlled by keen-eyed, space-hardened veterans inside the pirates' planetoid. But they were to receive an inkling of it. As ship after ship of the pirate fleet was destroyed, Roger realized that his navy was beaten, and forthwith all his surviving vessels darted toward the apex of the cone, where the heaviest battleships were stationed. There, each hurled itself upon a triplanetary warship, crashing to its own destruction, but in that destruction ensuring the loss of one of the heaviest vessels of the enemy. Thus passed the Fearless, and 20 of the finest spaceships of the fleet as well. But the ranking officer assumed command, the war cone was reformed, and, yawing maw to the fore, the great formation shot toward the pirate stronghold, now near at hand. It again launched its stupendous cylinder of annihilation, but even as the mighty defensive screens of the planetoid flared into incandescently furious defense, the battle was interrupted, and pirates and triplanetarians learned alike that they were not alone in the ether. Space became suffused with a redly impenetrable opacity, and through that indescribable pall there came reaching huge arms of force, incredible, writhing, coruscating beams of power which glowed a baleful, although almost imperceptible, red. A vessel of unheard-of armament and power, hailing from the then unknown solar system of Nevia, had come to rest in that space. For months her commander had been searching for one ultra-precious substance. Now his detectors had found it, and feeling neither fear of triplanetarian weapons, nor reluctance to sacrifice those thousands of triplanetarian lives, he was about to take it. End of Chapter 9. Triplanetary, first in the Lensman series by E. Doc Smith. Chapter 10, Within the Red Veil. Nevia, the home planet of the marauding spaceship, would have appeared peculiar indeed to terrestrial senses. High in the deep red heavens a fervent blue sun poured down its flood of brilliant purplish light upon a world of water. Not a cloud was to be seen in that flaming sky, and through that dustless atmosphere the eye could see the horizon, a horizon 3 times as distant as the one to which we are accustomed, with a distinctness and clarity impossible in our Terra's dust-filled air. As the mighty sun dropped below the horizon, the sky would fill suddenly with clouds, and rain would fall violently and steadily until midnight. Then the clouds would vanish as suddenly as they had come into being, the torrential downpour would cease, and through that huge world's wonderfully transparent gaseous envelope the full glory of the firmament would be revealed. Not the firmament as we know it, for that hot blue sun and Nevia, her one-planet child, were light years distant from old Sol and his numerous brood, but a strange and glorious firmament containing few constellations familiar to earthly eyes. Out of the vacuum of space, a fish-shaped vessel of the void, the vessel that was to attack so boldly both the massed fleet of Triplanetary and Roger's planetoid, plunged into the rarefied outer atmosphere, and crimson beams of force tore shriekingly through the thin air as it braked its terrific speed. A third of the circumference of Nevia's mighty globe was traversed before the velocity of the craft could be reduced sufficiently to make a landing possible. Then, approaching the twilight zone, the vessel dived vertically downward, and it became evident that Nevia was neither entirely aqueous nor devoid of intelligent life, for the blunt nose of the spaceship was pointing toward what was evidently a half-submerged city. A city whose buildings were flat-topped hexagonal towers, exactly alike in size, shape, color, and material. These buildings were arranged as the cells of a honeycomb would be if each cell were separated from its neighbors by a relatively narrow channel of water, and all were built of the same white metal. Many bridges and more tubes extended through the air from building to building, and the watery streets teemed with swimmers, with surface craft, and with submarines. The pilot, stationed immediately below the conical prow of the spaceship, peered intently through thick windows which afforded unobstructed vision in every direction. His 4 huge contractile eyes were active, each operating independently in sending its own message to his peculiar but capable brain. One was watching the instruments, the others scanned narrowly the immense swelling curve of the ship's belly, the water upon which his vessel was to land, and the floating dock to which it was to be moored. 4 hands, if hands they could be called, manipulated levers and wheels with infinite delicacy of touch, and with scarcely a splash the immense mass of the Nevian vessel struck the water and glided to a stop within a foot of its exact berth. 4 mooring bars dropped neatly into their sockets, and the captain pilot, after locking his controls in neutral, released his safety straps and leaped lightly from his padded bench to the floor. Scuttling across the floor and down a runway upon his 4 short, powerful, heavily scaled legs, he slipped smoothly into the water and flashed away, far below the surface. For Nevians are true amphibians. Their blood is cold, they use with equal comfort and efficiency gills and lungs for breathing. Their scaly bodies are equally at home in the water or in the air. Their broad, flat feet serve equally well for running about upon a solid surface or for driving their streamlined bodies through the water at a pace few fishes can equal. Through the water the Nevian commander darted along, steering his course accurately by means of his short, vaned tail. Through an opening in a wall he sped and along a submarine hallway, emerging upon a broad ramp. He scurried up the incline and into an elevator which lifted him to the top of the hexagon, directly into the office of the Secretary of Commerce of all Nevia. "Welcome, Captain Nerado." The secretary waved a tentacular arm, and the visitor sprang lightly upon a softly cushioned bench, where he lay at ease, facing the official across his low, flat desk. "We congratulate you upon the success of your final trial flight. We received all your reports, even while you were traveling at 10 times the velocity of light. With the last difficulties overcome, you are now ready to start?" "We are ready," the captain scientist replied soberly. "Mechanically, the ship is as nearly perfect as our finest minds can make her. She is stocked for 2 years. All the iron-bearing suns within reach have been plotted. Everything is ready except the iron. Of course the Council refused to allow us any of the national supply. How much were you able to purchase for us in the market?" "Nearly 10 pounds." 10 pounds! Why, the securities we left with you could not have bought 2 pounds, even at the price then prevailing." "No, but you have friends. Many of us believe in you, and have dipped into our own resources. You and your fellow scientists of the expedition have each contributed his entire personal fortune. Why should not some of the rest of us also contribute as private citizens?" "Wonderful! We thank you. 10 pounds!" The captain's great triangular eyes glowed with an intense violet light. "At least a year of cruising. But what if, after all, we should be wrong?" "In that case, you shall have consumed 10 pounds of irreplaceable metal." The secretary was unmoved. "That is the viewpoint of the Council, and of almost everyone else. It is not the waste of treasure they object to. It is the fact that 10 pounds of iron will be forever lost." "A high price, truly," the Columbus of Nevia assented. "And after all, I may be wrong." "You probably are wrong," his host made startling answer. "It is practically certain, it is almost a demonstrable mathematical fact, that no other sun within hundreds of thousands of light years of our own has a planet. In all probability, Nevia is the only planet in the entire universe. We are probably the only intelligent life in the universe. There is only one chance in numberless millions that anywhere within the cruising range of your newly perfected spaceship there may be an iron-bearing planet upon which you can effect a landing. There is a larger chance, however, that you may be able to find a small, cold, iron-bearing cosmic body, small enough so that you can capture it. Although there are no mathematics by which to evaluate the probability of such an occurrence, it is upon that larger chance that some of us are staking a portion of our wealth. We expect no return whatever, but if you should, by some miracle, happen to succeed, what then? Deep seas being made shallow? Civilization extending itself over the globe, science advancing by leaps and bounds, Nevia becoming populated as she should be peopled. That, my friend, is a chance well worth taking." The secretary called in a group of guards, who escorted the small package of priceless metal to the spaceship. Before the massive door was sealed, the friends bade each other farewell. I will keep in touch with you on the ultrawave," the captain concluded. "After all, I do not blame the Council for refusing to allow the other ship to go out. 10 pounds of iron will be a fearful loss to the world. If we should find iron, however, see to it that she loses no time in following us." "No fear of that. If you find iron, she will set out at once, and all space will soon be full of vessels. Goodbye." The last opening was sealed, and Nerado shot the great vessel into the air. Up and up, out beyond the last tenuous trace of atmosphere, on and on through space it flew with ever-increasing velocity, until Nevia's gigantic blue sun had been left so far behind that it became a splendid blue-white star. Then projectors cut off to save the precious iron whose disintegration furnished them power. For week after week, Captain Nerado and his venturesome crew of scientists drifted idly through the illimitable void. There is no need to describe in detail Nerado's tremendous voyage. Suffice it to say that he found a G-type dwarf star possessing planets, not one planet only, but 6, 7, 8, yes, at least 9, and most of those worlds were themselves centers of attraction around which were circling one or more worldlets. Nerado thrilled with joy as he applied a full retarding force, and every creature aboard that great vessel had to peer into a plate or through a telescope before he could believe that planets other than Nevia did in reality exist. Velocity checked to the merest crawl, as space speeds go, and with electromagnetic detector screens full out, the Nevian vessel crept toward our sun. Finally, the detectors encountered an obstacle, a conductive substance which the patterns showed conclusively to be practically pure iron. An enormous mass of it floating alone out in space. Without waiting to investigate the nature, appearance, or structure of the precious mass, Nerado ordered power into the converters and drove an enormous softening field of force upon the object. A force of such a nature that it would condense the metallic iron into an allotropic modification of much smaller bulk. A red, viscous, extremely dense, and heavy liquid which could be stored conveniently in his tanks. No sooner had the precious liquid been stored away than the detectors again broke into an uproar. In one direction was an enormous mass of iron, scarcely detectable; in another a great number of smaller masses; in a third an isolated mass comparatively small in size. Space seemed to be full of iron, and Nerado drove his most powerful beam toward distant Nevia and sent an exultant message. "We have found iron, easily obtained and in unthinkable quantity, not in fractions of milligrams, but in millions upon unmeasured millions of tons. Send our sister ship here at once." "Nerado." The captain was called to one of the observation plates as soon as he had opened his key. "I have been investigating the mass of iron now nearest us, the small one. It is an artificial structure, a small spaceboat, and there are 3 creatures in it. Monstrosities, certainly, but they must possess some intelligence, or they could not be navigating space." "What? Impossible!" exclaimed the chief explorer. "Probably then the other was... but no matter. We had to have the iron. Bring the boat in without converting it, so that we may study at our leisure both the beings and their mechanisms." And Nerado swung his own busy-ray beam into the emergency boat, seeing there the armored figures of Cleo Marston and the 2 Triplanetary officers. "They are indeed intelligent," Nerado commented, as he detected and silenced Costigan's ultrabeam communicator. "Not, however, as intelligent as I had supposed," he went on, after studying the peculiar creatures and their tiny spaceship more in detail. "They have immense stores of iron, yet use it for nothing other than building material. They make little and inefficient use of atomic energy. They apparently have a rudimentary knowledge of ultrawaves, but do not use them intelligently. They cannot neutralize even these ordinary forces we are now employing. They are, of course, more intelligent than the lower ganoids, or even than some of the higher fishes, but by no stretch of the imagination can they be compared to us. I am quite relieved. I was afraid that in my haste I might have slain members of a highly developed race." The helpless boat, all her forces neutralized, was brought up close to the immense flying fish. There flaming knives of force sliced her neatly into sections, and the 3 rigid armored figures, after being bereft of their external weapons, were brought through the airlocks and into the control room, while the pieces of their boat were stowed away for future study. The Nevian scientists first analyzed the air inside the spacesuits of the terrestrials, then carefully removed the protective coverings of the captives. Costigan, fully conscious through it all and now able to move a little, since the peculiar temporary paralysis was wearing off, braced himself for he knew not what shock, but it was needless. Their grotesque captors were not torturers. The air, while somewhat more dense than Earth and of a peculiar odor, was eminently breathable, and even though the vessel was motionless in space, an almost normal gravitation gave them a large fraction of their usual weight. After the three had been relieved of their pistols and other articles which the Nevians thought might prove to be weapons, the strange paralysis was lifted entirely. The earthling clothing puzzled the captors immensely, but so strenuous were the objections raised to its removal that they did not press the point, but fell back to study their find in detail. Then faced each other the representatives of the civilizations of two widely separated solar systems. The Nevians studied the human beings with interest and curiosity, blended largely with loathing and repulsion. The three terrestrials regarded the unmoving, expressionless faces, if those coned heads could be said to possess such thing, with horror and disgust, as well as with other emotions, each according to his type and training. For to human eyes, the Nevian is a fearful thing. Even today there are few terrestrials, or Solarians for that matter, who can look at a Nevian eye to eye without feeling a creeping of the skin and experience a gone sensation in the pit of the stomach. The horny, wrinkled, drought-resisting Martian, whom we all know and rather like, is a hideous being indeed. The bat-eyed, colorless, hairless, practically skinless Venerian is worse. But they both are, after all, remote cousins of Terra's humanity, and we get along with them quite well whenever we are compelled to visit Mars or Venus. But the Nevians! The horizontal, flat, fish-like body is not so bad, even supported as it is by four short, powerful, scaly, flat-footed legs, and terminating as it does in the weird, four-vaned tail. The neck even is endurable, although it is long and flexible, heavily scaled, and is carried in whatever eye-wringing loops or curves the owner considers most convenient or ornamental at the time. Even the smell of a Nevian, a malodorous reek of overripe fish, does in time become tolerable, especially if sufficiently disguised with creosote, which purely terrestrial chemical is the most highly prized perfume of Nevia. But the head. It is that member that makes the Nevian so appalling to earthly eyes, for it is a thing utterly foreign to all Solarian history or experience. As most Tellurians already know, it is fundamentally a massive cone, covered with scales, based spear-like upon the neck. Four great sea-green, triangular eyes are spaced equidistant from each other about halfway up the cone. The pupils are contractile at will, like the eyes of a cat, permitting the Nevian to see equally well in any ordinary extreme of light or darkness. Immediately below each eye springs out a long, jointless, boneless, tentacular arm, an arm which at its extremity divides into 8 delicate and sensitive but very strong fingers. Below each arm is a mouth, a beaked, needle-tusked orifice of dire potentialities. Finally, under the overhanging edge of the cone-shaped head are the delicately frilled organs which serve either as gills or as nostrils and lungs, as may be desired. To other Nevians the eyes and other features are highly expressive, but to us they appear utterly cold and unmoving. Terrestrial senses can detect no changes of expression in a Nevian's face. Such were the frightful beings at whom the three prisoners stared with sinking hearts. But if we human beings have always considered Nevians grotesque and repulsive, the feeling has always been mutual. For these monstrous beings are a highly intelligent and extremely sensitive race, and our, to us, trim and graceful human forms seem to them the very quintessence of malformation and hideousness. "Good heavens, Conway!" Clio exclaimed, shrinking against Costigan as his left arm flashed around her. "What horrible monstrosities! And they can't talk. Not one of them has made a sound. Suppose they can be deaf and dumb?" But at the same time Nerado was addressing his fellows. "What hideous, deformed creatures they are! Truly a low form of life, even though they do possess some intelligence. They cannot talk, and have made no signs of having heard our words to them. Do you suppose that they communicate by sight? That those weird contortions of their peculiarly placed organs serve as speech?" thus both sides, neither realizing that the other had spoken. For the Nevian voice is pitched so high that the lowest tone audible to them is far above our limit of hearing. The shrillest note of a terrestrial piccolo is to them so profoundly low that it cannot be heard. "We have much to do." Narado turned away from the captives. "We must postpone further study of the specimens until we have taken aboard a full cargo of iron which is so plentiful here." "What shall we do with them, sir?" asked one of the Nevian officers. "Lock them in one of the storage rooms?" "Oh, no. They might die there, and we must by all means keep them in good condition, to be studied most carefully by the fellows of the College of Science. What a commotion there will be when we bring in this group of strange creatures, living proof that there are other suns possessing planets which are supporting organic and intelligent life. You may put them in 3 communicating rooms, say in the 4th section. They will undoubtedly require light and exercise. Lock all the exits, of course, but it would be best to leave the doors between the rooms unlocked so that they can be together or apart as they choose. Since the smallest one, the female, stays so close to the larger male, it may be that they are mates. But since we know nothing of their habits or customs, it will be best to give them all possible freedom compatible with safety." Narado turned back to his instruments, and 3 of the frightful crew came up to the human beings. One walked away, waving a couple of arms in an unmistakable signal that the prisoners were to follow him. The 3 obediently set out after him, the other 2 guards falling behind. "Now's our best chance," Costigan muttered, as they passed through a low doorway and entered a narrow corridor. "Watch that one ahead of you. Cleo, hold him for a second if you can. Bradley, you and I will take the 2 behind us. Now!" Costigan stooped and whirled. Seizing a cable-like arm, he pulled the outlandish head down, the while the full power of his mighty right leg drove a heavy service boot into the place where scaly neck and head joined. The Nevian fell, and instantly Costigan leaped at the leader, ahead of the girl. Leaped, but dropped to the floor, again paralyzed. For the Nevian leader had been alert, his 4 eyes covering the entire circle of vision, and he had acted rapidly. Not in time to stop Costigan's first berserk attack. The first officer's reactions were practically instantaneous, and he moved fast, but in time to retain command of the situation. Another Nevian appeared, and while the stricken guard was recovering, all 4 arms wrapped tightly around his convulsing, looping, writhing neck, the 3 helpless terrestrials were lifted into the air and carried bodily into the quarters to which Narado had assigned them. Not until they had been placed upon cushions in the middle room, and the heavy metal doors had been locked upon them, did they again find themselves able to use arms or legs. "Well, that's another round we lose," Costigan commented cheerfully. "A guy can't mix it very well when he can neither kick, strike, nor bite. I expected those lizards to rough me up then, but they didn't." "They don't want to hurt us. They want to take us home with them, wherever that is, as curiosities, like wild animals or something," decided the girl shrewdly. "They're pretty bad, of course, but I like them a lot better than I do Roger and his robots, anyway." "I think you have the right idea, Miss Marston," Bradley rumbled. "That's it exactly. I feel like a bear in a cage. I should think you'd feel worse than ever. What chance has an animal of escaping from a menagerie?" "These animals? Lots. I'm feeling better and better all the time," Cleo declared. And her serene bearing bore out her words. "You, too, got us out of that horrible place of Roger's, and I'm pretty sure that you will get us away from here, somehow or other. They may think we're stupid animals, but before you 2 and the Triplanetary Patrol and the Service get done with them, they'll have another think coming." "That's the old fight, Cleo," cheered Costigan. "I haven't got it figured out as close as you have, but I get about the same answer. These 4-legged fish carry considerably heavier stuff than Roger did, I'm thinking, but they'll be up against something themselves pretty quick that is no lightweight, believe me." "Do you know something, or are you just whistling in the dark?" Bradley demanded. "I know a little, not much. Engineering and research have been working on a new ship for a long time. A ship to travel so much faster than light that it can go anywhere in the galaxy and back in a month or so. New sub-ether drive, new atomic power, new armament, new everything. Only bad thing about it is that it doesn't work so good yet. It's fuller of bugs than a Venerian's kitchen. It has blown up 5 times that I know of and has killed 29 men. But when they get it lit, they'll have something." "When or if?" asked Bradley pessimistically. "I said when," snapped Costigan, his voice cutting. "When the Service goes after anything, they get it, and when they get it, it stays—" He broke off abruptly, and his voice lost its edge. "Sorry, didn't mean to get high, but I think we'll have help if we can keep our heads up a while. And it looks good. These are first-class cages they've given us. All the comforts of home, even to lookout plates. Let's see what's going on, shall we?" After some experimenting with the unfamiliar controls, Costigan learned how to operate the Nevian visiray. And upon the plate they saw the cone of battle hurling itself toward Roger's planetoid. They saw the pirate fleet rush out to do battle with Triplanetary's massed forces, and with bated breath they watched every maneuver of that epic battle to its savagely sacrificial end. And that same battle was being watched, also with the most intense interest, by the Nevians in their control room. "It is indeed a bloodthirsty combat," mused Narado at his observation plate, "and it is peculiar, or rather probably only to be expected from a race of such a low stage of development, that they employ only ether-borne forces. Warfare seems universal among primitive types. Indeed, it was not so long ago that our own cities, few in number though they are, ceased fighting each other and combined against the semi-civilized fishes of the greater deeps." He fell silent, and for many minutes watched the furious battle between the two navies of the void. That conflict ended, he watched the Triplanetary fleet reform its battle cone and rush upon the planetoid. "Destruction, always destruction," he sighed, adjusting his power switches. "Since they are bent upon mutual destruction, I can see no purpose in refraining from destroying all of them. We need the iron, and they are a useless race." He launched his softening, converting field of dull red energy. Vast as that field was, it could not encompass the whole fleet, but half of the lip of the gigantic cone soon disappeared, its component vessels subsiding into a sluggishly flowing stream of allotropic iron. The fleet, abandoning its attack upon the planetoid, swung its cone around to bring the flame-erupting axis to bear upon the formless something dimly perceptible to the ultravision of Sam's observers. Furiously the gigantic composite beam of the massed fleet was hurled, nor was it alone. For Gharlane had known, ever since the easy escape of his human prisoners, that something was occurring which was completely beyond his experience, although not beyond his theoretical knowledge. He had found the sub-ether closed. He had been unable to make his sub-ethereal weapons operative against either the three captives or the war vessels of the Triplanetary Patrol. Now, however, he could work in that sub-ethereal murk of the newcomers. A light trial showed him that if he so wished, he could use sub-ethereal offenses against them. What was the real meaning of those facts? He had become convinced that those three persons were no more human than was Roger himself. Who or what was activating them? It was definitely not Eddorian workmanship. No Eddorian would have developed those particular techniques, nor could possibly have developed them without his knowledge. What then? To do what had been done necessitated the existence of a race as old and as capable as the Eddorians, but of an entirely different nature, and according to Eddor's vast information center, no such race existed, or ever had existed. Those visitors, possessing mechanisms supposedly known only to the science of Eddor, would also be expected to possess the mental powers which had been exhibited. Were they recent arrivals from some other space-time continuum? Probably not. Eddorian surveys had found no trace of any such life in any reachable plenum. Since it would be utterly fantastic to postulate the unheralded appearance of two such races at practically the same moment, the conclusion seemed unavoidable that these as yet unknown beings were the protectors, the activators rather, of the two Triplanetary officers and the woman. This view was supported by the fact that, while the strangers had attacked Triplanetary's fleet and had killed thousands of Triplanetary's men, they had actually rescued those three supposedly human beings. The planetoid, then, would be attacked next. Very well, he would join Triplanetary in attacking them, with weapons no more dangerous to them than Triplanetary's own, the while preparing his real attack, which would come later. Roger issued orders and waited, and thought more and more intensely upon one point which remained obscure. Why, when the strangers themselves destroyed Triplanetary's fleet, had Roger been unable to use his most potent weapons against that fleet? Thus, then, for the first time in Triplanetary's history, the forces of law and order joined hands with those of piracy and banditry against a common foe. Rods, beams, planes, and stilettos of unbearable energy the doomed fleet launched, in addition to its terrifically destructive main beam. Roger hurled every material weapon at his command, but bombs, high-explosive shells, even the ultra-deadly atomic torpedoes alike were ineffective. Alike simply vanished in the redly murky veil of nothingness. And the fleet was being melted. In quick succession, the vessels flamed red, shrank together, gave out their air, and merged their component iron into the intensely crimson, sullenly viscous stream which was flowing through the impenetrable veil against which both Triplanetarians and pirates were directing their terrific offense. The last vessel of the attacking cone having been converted, and the resulting metal stored away, the Nevians, as Roger had anticipated, turned their attention toward the planetoid. But that structure was no feeble warship. It had been designed by and built under the personal supervision of Garlane of Eddore. It was powered, equipped, and armed to meet any emergency which Garlane's tremendous mind had been able to envision. Its entire bulk was protected by the shield whose qualities had so surprised Costigan, a shield far more effective than any Tellurian scientist or engineer would have believed possible. The voracious converting beam of the Nevians, below the level of the ether though it was, struck that shield and rebounded, defeated and futile. Struck again rebounded, then struck and clung hungrily, licking out over that impenetrable surface in darting tongues of flame as the surprised Dorado doubled and then quadrupled his power. Fiercer and fiercer the Nevian flood of force drove in. The whole immense globe of the planetoid became one scintillating ball of raw, red energy, but still the pirate's shield remained intact. Gray Roger sat coldly motionless at his great desk, the top of which was now swung up to reveal a panel of massed and tiered instruments and controls. He could carry this load forever. But unless he was very wrong, this load would change shortly. What then? The essence that was Garlane could not be killed, could not even be hurt by any physical, chemical, or nuclear force. Should he stay with the planetoid to its end, and thus perforce return to Eddore with no material evidence whatever? He would not. Too much remained undone. Any report based upon his present information could be neither complete nor conclusive, and reports submitted by Garlane of Eddore to the coldly cynical and ruthlessly analytical innermost circle had always been and always would be both. It was a fact that there existed at least one non-Eddorian mind which was the equal of his own. If one, there would be a race of such minds. The thought was galling. But to deny the existence of a fact would be the essence of stupidity. Since power of mind was a function of time, that race must be of approximately the same age as his own. Therefore, the Eddorian Information Center, which, by the inference of its completeness, denied the existence of such a race, was wrong. It was not complete. Why was it not complete? The only possible reason for two such races remaining unaware of the existence of each other would be the deliberate intent of one of them. Therefore, at some time in the past, the two races had been in contact for at least an instant of time. All Eddorian knowledge of that meeting had been suppressed, and no more contacts had been allowed to occur. The conclusion reached by Garlane was a disturbing thing indeed, but being an Eddorian, he faced it squarely. He did not have to wonder how such a suppression could have been accomplished. He knew. He also knew that his own mind contained everything known to every ancestor since the first Eddorian was. The probability was exceedingly great that if any such contact had ever been made, his mind would still contain at least some information concerning it, however carefully suppressed that knowledge had been. He thought. Back, further back, farther still. And as he thought, an interfering force began to pluck at him, as though palpable tongs were pulling out of line the mental probe with which he was exploring the hitherto unplumbed recesses of his mind. "Ah, so you do not want me to remember?" Roger asked aloud, with no change in any lineament of his hard gray face. "I wonder, do you really believe that you can keep me from remembering? I must abandon this search for the moment, but rest assured that I shall finish it very shortly. Here is the analysis of his screen, sir." A Nevian computer handed his chief a sheet of metal, bearing rows of symbols. "Ah, a polycyclic. Complete coverage. A screen of that type was scarcely to have been expected from such a low form of life, Narado commented, and began to adjust dials and controls. As he did so, the character of the clinging mantle of force changed. From red, it flamed quickly through the spectrum, became unbearably violet, then disappeared. And as it disappeared, the shielding wall began to give way. It did not cave in abruptly, but softened locally, sagging into a peculiar grouping of valleys and ridges, contesting stubbornly every inch of position lost. Roger experimented briefly with inertialessness. No use. As he had expected, they were prepared for that. He summoned a few of the ablest of his scientist slaves and issued instructions. For minutes, a host of robots toiled mightily, then a portion of the shield bulged out and became a tube extending beyond the attacking layers of force, a tube from which there erupted a beam of violence incredible, a beam behind which was every erg of energy that the gigantic mechanisms of the planetoid could yield, a beam that tore a hole through the redly impenetrable Nevian field and hurled itself upon the inner screen of the fish-shaped cruiser in frenzied incandescence. And was there, or was there not, a lesser eruption upon the other side? An almost imperceptible flash, as though something had shot from the doomed planetoid out into space? Narado's neck writhed convulsively as his tortured drivers whined and shrieked at the terrific overload, but Roger's effort was far too intense to be long maintained. Generator after generator burned out, the defensive screen collapsed, and the red converter beam attacked voraciously the unresisting metal of those prodigious walls. Soon there was a terrific explosion as the pent-up air of the planetoid broke through its weakening container, and the sluggish river of allotropic iron flowed in an ever larger stream, ever faster. It is well that we had an unlimited supply of iron. Narado almost tied a knot in his neck as he spoke in huge relief. With but the 7 pounds remaining of our original supply, I fear that it would have been difficult to parry that last thrust. Difficult? Asked the second-in-command. We would now be free atoms in space. But what shall I do with this iron? Our reservoirs will not hold more than half of it. And how about that one ship which remains untouched? Jettison enough supplies from the lower holds to make room for this lot. As for that one ship, let it go. We will be overloaded as it is, and it is of the utmost importance that we get back to Nevia as soon as possible. This, if Gharlane could have heard it, would have answered his question. All Arisia knew that it was necessary for the camera ship to survive. The Nevians were interested only in iron, but the Eddorian, being a perfectionist, would not have been satisfied with anything less than the complete destruction of every vessel of Triplanetary's fleet. The Nevian spaceship moved away, sluggishly now because of its prodigious load. In their quarters in the fourth section, the 3 terrestrials who had watched with strained attention the downfall and absorption of the planetoid stared at each other with drawn faces. Cleo broke the silence. "Oh, Conway, this is ghastly. It's just simply too damn perfectly horrible," she gasped, then recovered a measure of her customary spirit as she stared in surprise at Costigan's face. For it was thoughtful. His eyes were bright and keen. No trace of fear or disorganization was visible in any line of his hard young face. "It's not so good," he admitted frankly. "I wish I wasn't such a dumb cluck. If Lyman Cleveland or Fred Rodebush were here, they could help a lot, but I don't know enough about any of their stuff to flag a handcar. I can't even interpret that funny flash, if it really was a flash that we saw." "Why bother about one little flash, after all that really did happen?" asked Cleo curiously. "You think Roger launched something? He couldn't have. I didn't see a thing," Bradley argued. "I don't know what to think. I've never seen anything material sent out so fast that I couldn't trace it with an ultrawave, but on the other hand, Roger's got a lot of stuff that I never saw anywhere else. However, I don't see that it has anything to do with the fix we're in right now. But at that, we might be worse off. We're still breathing air, you notice, and if they don't blanket my wave, I can still talk." He put both hands into his pockets and spoke. "Sams, Costigan, put me on a recorder, quick. I probably haven't got much time." And for 10 minutes he talked, concisely and as rapidly as he could utter words, reporting clearly and exactly everything that had transpired. Suddenly he broke off, writhing in agony. Frantically he tore his shirt open and hurled a tiny object across the room. "Wow!" he exclaimed. "They may be deaf, but they can certainly detect an ultrawave, and what an interference they can set up on it. No, I'm not hurt, he reassured the anxious girl, now at his side, but it's a good thing I had you out of the circuit. It would have jolted you loose from 6 or 7 of your back teeth. Have you any idea where they're taking us? She asked soberly. No, he answered flatly, looking deep into her steadfast eyes. No use lying to you. If I know you at all, you'd rather take it standing up. That talk of Jovians and Neptunians is the bunk. Nothing like that ever grew in our Solarian system. All the signs say that we're going for a long ride. End of chapter 10. Triplanetary, first in the Lensman series by E. Doc Smith. Chapter 11, Nevian Strife. The Nevian spaceship was hurtling upon its way. Space navigators both. The 2 terrestrial officers soon discovered that it was even then moving with a velocity far above that of light, and that it must be accelerating at a high rate, even though to them it seemed stationary. They could feel only a gravitational force somewhat less than that of their native Earth. Bradley, seasoned old campaigner that he was, had retired promptly as soon as he had completed a series of observations, and was sleeping soundly upon a pile of cushions in the first of the 3 interconnecting rooms. In the middle room, which was to be Clio's, Costigan was standing very close to the girl, but was not touching her. His body was rigid, his face was tense and drawn. "You are wrong, Conway. All wrong," Clio was saying very seriously. "I know how you feel, but it's false chivalry. That isn't it at all," he insisted stubbornly. "It isn't only that I've got you out here in space, in danger and alone, that's stopping me. I know you, and I know myself well enough to know that what we start now we'll go through with for life. It doesn't make any difference that way whether I start making love to you now, or whether I wait until we're back on Tellus. But I'm telling you that for your own good you'd better pass me up entirely. I've got enough horsepower to keep away from you if you tell me to, not otherwise." "I know it both ways, dear, but—" "But nothing," he interrupted. "Can't you get it into your skull what you'll be letting yourself in for if you marry me? Assume that we get back, which isn't sure by any means. But even if we do, some day, and maybe soon too, you can't tell, somebody is going to collect 50 grams of radium for my head." 50 grams? And everybody knows that Sam's himself is rated at only 60? "I knew that you were somebody, Conway," Clio exclaimed, undeterred. "But at that, something tells me that any pirate will earn even that much reward several times over before he collects it. Don't be silly, my dear. Good night." She tipped her head back, holding up to him her red, sweetly curved, smiling lips, and his arms swept around her. Her arms went up around his neck, and they stood, clasped together in the motionless ecstasy of love's first embrace. "Girl, how I love you!" Costigan's voice was husky. His usually hard eyes were glowing with a tender light. "That settles that. I'll really live now, anyway, while—" "Stop it," she commanded sharply. "You're going to live until you die of old age. See if you don't. You'll simply have to, Conway." "That's so, too. No percentage in dying now. All the pirates between Tellus and Andromeda couldn't take me after this. I've got too much to live for. Well, good night, sweetheart. I'd better beat it. You need some sleep." The lovers' parting was not as simple and straightforward a procedure as Costigan's speech would indicate, but finally he did seek his own room and relaxed upon a pile of cushions, his stern visage transformed. Instead of the low metal ceiling he saw a beautiful, oval, tanned young face, framed in a golden blonde corona of hair. His gaze sank into the depths of loyal, honest, dark blue eyes, and looking deeper and deeper into those blue wells, he fell asleep. Upon his face, too set and grim by far for a man of his years, the lives of sector chiefs of the Triplanetary service were not easy, nor as a rule were they long. There lingered as he slept that newly acquired softness of expression, the reflection of his transcendent happiness. For 8 hours he slept soundly, as was his wont. Then, also according to his habit and training, he came wide awake, with no intermediate stage of napping. "Clio," he whispered. "Awake, girl? Awake!" Her voice came through the ultrophone, relief in every syllable. "Good heavens, I thought you were going to sleep until we got to wherever it is that we're going. Come on in, you two. I don't see how you can possibly sleep, just as though you were home in bed." "You've got to learn to sleep anywhere if you expect to keep in—" Costigan broke off as he opened the door and saw Clio's wan face. She had evidently spent a sleepless and racking 8 hours. "Good Lord, Clio, why didn't you call me?" "Oh, I'm all right, except for being a little jittery. No need of asking how you feel, is there?" "No, I feel hungry," he answered cheerfully. "I'm going to see what we can do about it. Or say, I guess I'll see whether they're still interfering on Sam's wave." He took out the small insulated case and touched the contact stud lightly with his finger. His arm jerked away powerfully. "Still at it," he gave the unnecessary explanation. "They don't seem to want us to talk outside. But this interference is as good as my talking. They can trace it, of course. Now I'll see what I can find out about our breakfast." He stepped over to the plate and shot its projector beam forward into the control room, where he saw Nerado lying dog-like at his instrument panel. As Costigan's beam entered the room, a blue light flashed on, and the Nevian turned an eye and an arm toward his own small observation plate. Knowing that they were now in visual communication, Costigan beckoned an invitation and pointed to his mouth in what he hoped was the universal sign of hunger. The Nevian waved an arm and fingered controls, and as he did so a wide section of the floor of Clio's room slid aside. The opening thus made revealed a table which rose upon its low pedestal, a table equipped with 3 softly cushioned benches and spread with a glittering array of silver and glassware. Bowls and platters of a dazzlingly white metal, narrow-waisted goblets of sheerest crystal. All were hexagonal, beautifully and intricately carved and etched in apparently conventional marine designs. And the table utensils of this strange race were peculiar indeed. There were tearing forceps of 16 needle-sharp curved teeth, there were flexible spatulas, there were deep and shallow ladles with flexible edges, there were many other peculiarly curved instruments at whose uses the terrestrials could not even guess, all having delicately fashioned handles to fit the long, slender fingers of the Nevians. But if the table and its appointments were surprising to the terrestrials, revealing as they did a degree of culture which none of them had expected to find in a race of beings so monstrous, the food was even more surprising, although in another sense. For the wonderful crystal goblets were filled with a grayish-green slime of a nauseous and overpowering odor. The smaller bowls were full of living sea spiders and other such delicacies, and each large platter contained a fish fully a foot long, raw and whole, garnished tastefully with red, purple, and green strands of seaweed. Clio looked once, then gasped, shutting her eyes and turning away from the table, but Costigan flipped the 3 fish into a platter and set it aside before he turned back to the visiplate. "They'll go good fried," he remarked to Bradley, signaling vigorously to Nerado that the meal was not acceptable, and that he wanted to talk to him in person. Finally he made himself clear, the table sank down out of sight, and the Nevian commander cautiously entered the room. At Costigan's insistence, he came up to the visiplate, leaving near the door 3 alert and fully armed guards. The man then shot the beam into the galley of the pirate's lifeboat, suggesting that they should be allowed to live there. For some time the argument of arms and fingers raged, though not exactly fluent conversation. Both sides managed to convey their meanings quite clearly. Nerado would not allow the terrestrials to visit their own ship. He was taking no chances, but after a thorough ultra-ray inspection, he did finally order some of his men to bring into the middle room the electric range and a supply of terrestrial food. Soon the Nevian fish were sizzling in a pan, and the appetizing odors of coffee and browning biscuit permeated the room. But at the first appearance of those odors, the Nevians departed hastily, content to watch the remainder of the curious and repulsive procedure in their Visiray plates. Breakfast over, and everything made tidy and shipshape, Costigan turned to Clio. "Look here, girl, you've got to learn how to sleep. You're all in. Your eyes look like you've been on a Martian picnic, and you didn't eat half enough breakfast. You've got to sleep and eat to keep fit. We don't want you passing out on us, so I'll put out this light and you'll lie down here and sleep until noon." "Oh, no, don't bother. I'll sleep tonight. I'm quite—" "You'll sleep now," he informed her levelly. "I never thought of you being nervous, with Bradley and me on each side of you. We're both right here now, though, and we'll stay here. We'll watch over you like a couple of old hens with one chick between them. Come on, lie down and go bye-bye." Clio laughed at the simile, but lay down obediently. Costigan sat upon the edge of the great divan, holding her hand, and they chatted idly. The silences grew longer. Clio's remarks became fewer, and soon her long-lashed eyelids fell, and her deep, regular breathing showed that she was sound asleep. The man stared at her, his very heart in his eyes. So young, so beautiful, so lovely, and how he did love her! He was not formally religious, but his every thought was a prayer. If he could only get her out of this mess. He wasn't fit to live on the same planet with her, but just give him one chance, God, just one. But Costigan had been laboring for days under a terrific strain, and he had been going very short on sleep, half hypnotized by his own mixed emotions, and by his staring at the smooth curves of Clio's cheek. His own eyes closed, and still holding her hand, he sank down into the soft cushions beside her and into oblivion. Thus sleeping hand in hand like two children, Bradley found them, and a tender fatherly expression came over his face as he looked down at them. "Nice little girl, Clio," he mused, "and when they made Costigan, they broke the mold. They'll do. About as fine a couple of kids as old Tellus ever produced. I could do with some more sleep myself." He yawned prodigiously, lay down at Clio's left, and in minutes was himself asleep. Hours later both men were awakened by a merry peal of laughter. Clio was sitting up, regarding them with sparkling eyes. She was refreshed, buoyant, ravenously hungry, and highly amused. Costigan was amazed and annoyed at what he considered a failure in his self-appointed task. Bradley was calm and matter-of-fact. "Thanks for being such a nice bodyguard, you two." Clio laughed again, but sobered quickly. "I slept wonderfully well, but I wonder if I can sleep tonight without making you hold my hand all night?" "Oh, he doesn't mind doing that," Bradley commented. "Mind it?" Costigan exclaimed, and his eyes and his tone spoke volumes. They prepared and ate another meal, one to which Clio did full justice. Rested and refreshed, they had begun to discuss possibilities of escape when Nerado and his 3 armed guards entered the room. The Nevian scientist placed a box upon a table and began to make adjustments upon its panels, eyeing the terrestrials attentively after each setting. After a time, a staccato burst of articulated speech issued from the box, and Costigan saw a great light. "You got it! Hold it!" he exclaimed, waving his arms excitedly. "You see, Clio, their voices are pitched either higher or lower than ours, probably higher, and they've built an audio frequency changer. He's nobody's fool, that lizard." Nerado heard Costigan's voice. There was no doubt of that. His long neck looped and twisted in Nevian gratification, and although neither side could understand the other, both knew that intelligent speech and hearing were attributes common to the two races. This fact altered markedly the relations between captors and captives. The Nevians admitted amongst themselves that the strange bipeds might be quite intelligent after all, and the terrestrials at once became more hopeful. "It isn't so bad if they can talk," Costigan summed up the situation. "We might as well take it easy and make the best of it, particularly since we haven't been able to figure out any possible way of getting away from them. They can talk and hear, and we can learn their language in time. Maybe we can make some sort of deal with them to take us back to our own system, if we can't make a break." The Nevians being as eager as the terrestrials to establish communication, Nerado kept the newly devised frequency changer in constant use. There is no need of describing at length the details of that interchange of languages. Suffice it to say that, starting at the very bottom, they learned as babies learned, but with a great advantage over babies of possessing fully developed and capable brains. And while the humans were learning the tongue of Nevia, several of the amphibians and, incidentally, Clio Marston, were learning Triplanetarian, the 2 officers knowing well that it would be much easier for the Nevians to learn the logically built common language of the 3 planets than to master the senseless intricacies of English. In a short time the 2 parties were able to understand each other after a fashion by using a weird mixture of both languages. As soon as a few ideas had been exchanged, the Nevian scientists built transformers small enough to be worn collar-like by the terrestrials, and the captives were allowed to roam at will throughout the great vessel, only the compartment in which was stored the dismembered pirate lifeboat being sealed to them. Thus it was that they were not left long in doubt when another fish-shaped cruiser of the void was revealed upon their lookout plates in the awful emptiness of interstellar space. "This is our sister ship, going to your Solarian system for a cargo of the iron which is so plentiful there," Nerado explained to his involuntary guests. "I hope the gang has got the bugs worked out of our super ship," Costigan muttered savagely to his companions as Nerado turned away. If they have, that outfit will get something more than a load of iron when they get there. More time passed, during which a blue-white star separated itself from the infinitely distant firmament and began to show a perceptible disk. Larger and larger it grew, becoming bluer and bluer as the flying spaceship approached it, until finally Nevia could be seen, apparently close beside her parent orb. Heavily laden though the vessel was, such was her power that she was soon dropping vertically downward toward a large lagoon in the middle of the Nevian city. That bit of open water was devoid of life, for this was to be no ordinary landing. Under the terrific power of the beams breaking the descent of that unimaginable load of allotropic iron, the water seethed and boiled, and instead of floating gracefully upon the surface of the sea, this time the huge ship of space sank like a plummet to the bottom. Having accomplished the delicate feat of docking the vessel safely in the immense cradle prepared for her, Nerado turned to the Tellurians, who, now under guard, had been brought before him. "While our cargo of iron is being discharged, I am to take you 3 specimens to the College of Science, where you are to undergo a thorough physical and psychological examination. Follow me." "Wait a minute," protested Costigan, with a quick and furtive wink at his companions. "Do you expect us to go through water, and at this frightful depth?" "Certainly," replied the Nevian in surprise. "You are air breathers, of course, but you must be able to swim a little, and this slight depth, but little more than 30 of your meters, will not trouble you." "You are wrong twice," declared the terrestrial convincingly. "If by swimming you mean propelling yourself in or through the water, we know nothing of it. In water over our heads we drown helplessly in a minute or two, and the pressure at this depth would kill us instantly." "Well, I could take a lifeboat, of course, but that—" The Nevian captain began doubtfully, but broke off at the sound of a staccato call from his signal panel. "Captain Nerado, attention!" "Nerado," he acknowledged into a microphone. "The third city is being attacked by the fishes of the greater deeps. They have developed new and powerful mobile fortresses, mounting unheard-of weapons, and the city reports that it cannot long withstand their attack. They are asking for all possible help. Your vessel not only has vast stores of iron, but also mounts weapons of power. You are requested to proceed to their aid at the earliest possible moment." Nerado snapped out orders, and the liquid iron fell in streams from wide-open ports, forming a vast red pool in the bottom of the dock. In a short time the great vessel was in equilibrium with the water she displaced, and as soon as she had attained a slight buoyancy, the ports snapped shut, and Nerado threw on the power. "Go back to your own quarters and stay there until I send for you," the Nevian directed, and as the terrestrials obeyed the curt order, the cruiser tore herself from the water and flashed up into the crimson sky. "What a bare-faced liar!" Bradley exclaimed. The 3, transformers cut off, were back in the middle room of their suite. "You can outswim an otter, and I happen to know that you came up out of the old DZ-83 from a depth of—" "Maybe I did exaggerate a trifle," Costigan interrupted. "But the more helpless he thinks we are, the better for us. And we want to stay out of any of their cities as long as we can, because they may be hard places to get out of. I've got a couple of ideas, but they aren't ripe enough to pick yet. Wow, how this bird's been traveling! We're there already. If he hits the water going like this, he'll split himself sure." With undiminished velocity, they were flashing downward in a long slant toward the beleaguered third city. And from the flying vessel there was launched toward the city's central lagoon a torpedo. No missile this, but a capsule containing a full ton of allotropic iron, which could be of more use to the Nevian defenders than millions of men. For the third city was sore pressed indeed. Around it was one unbroken ring of boiling, exploding water billowing upward in searing, blinding bursts of superheated steam, or being hurled bodily in all directions in solid masses by the cataclysmic forces being released by the embattled fishes of the greater deeps. Her outer defenses were already down, and even as the terrestrials stared in amazement, another of the immense hexagonal buildings burst into fragments, its upper structure flying wildly into scrap metal, its lower half subsiding drunkenly below the surface of the boiling sea. The 3 Earth people seized whatever supports were at hand as the Nevian spaceship struck the water with undiminished speed, but the precaution was needless. Nerado knew thoroughly his vessel, its strengths and its capabilities. There was a mighty splash, but that was all. The artificial gravity was unchanged by the impact. To the passengers, the vessel was still motionless and on even keel as, now a submarine, she snapped around like a very fish and attacked the rear of the nearest fortress. For fortresses they were, vast structures of green metal, plowing forward implacably upon immense caterpillar treads. And as they crawled, they destroyed. And Costigan, exploring the strange submarine with his visiray beam, watched and marveled. For the fortresses were full of water. Water artificially cooled and aerated, entirely separate from the boiling flood through which they moved. They were manned by fish some 5 feet in length, fish with huge goggling eyes, fish plentifully equipped with long arm-like tentacles, fish poised before control panels or darting about intent upon their various duties, fish with brains waging war. Nor was their warfare ineffectual. Their heat rays boiled the water for hundreds of yards before them, and their torpedoes were exploding against the Nevian defenses in one appallingly continuous concussion. But most potent of all was a weapon unknown to triplanetary warfare. From a fortress there would shoot out, with the speed of a meteor, a long, jointed telescopic rod tipped with a tiny, brilliantly shining ball. Whenever that glowing tip encountered any obstacle, that obstacle disappeared in an explosion world-racking in its intensity. Then what was left of the rod, dark now, would be retracted into the fortress, only to emerge again in a moment with a tip once more shining and potent. Nerado, apparently as unfamiliar with the peculiar weapon as were the terrestrials, attacked cautiously, sending out far to the fore his murky, impenetrable screens of red. But the submarine was entirely non-ferrous, and its officers were apparently quite familiar with Nevian beams, which licked at and clung to the green walls in impotent fury. Through the red veil came stabbing ball after ball, and only the most frantic dodging saved the spaceship from destruction in those first few furious seconds. And now the Nevian defenders of the third city had secured and were employing the vast store of allotropic iron so opportunely delivered by Nerado. From the city there pushed out immense nets of metal, extending from the surface of the ocean to its bottom, nets radiating such terrific forces that the very water itself was beaten back and stood motionless in vertical, glassy walls. Torpedoes were futile against that wall of energy. The most fiercely driven rays of the fishes flamed incandescent against it in vain. Even the incredible violence of a concentration of every available force ball against one point could not break through. At that unimaginable explosion, water was hurled for miles. The bed of the ocean was not only exposed, but in it there was blown a crater, at whose dimensions the terrestrials dared not even guess. The crawling fortresses themselves were thrown backward violently, and the very world was rocked to its core by the concussion, but that iron-driven wall held. The massive nets swayed and gave back, and tidal waves hurled their mountainously destructive masses through the third city, but the mighty barrier remained intact. And Nerado, still attacking 2 of the powerful tanks with his every weapon, was still dodging those flashing balls charged with the quintessence of destruction. The fishes could not see through the subethereal veil, but all the gunners of the 2 fortresses were combing it thoroughly with ever-lengthening, ever-thrusting rods in a desperate attempt to wipe out the new and apparently all-powerful Nevian submarine, whose sheer power was slowly but inexorably crushing even their gigantic walls. "Well, I think that right now's the best chance we'll ever have of doing something for ourselves." Costigan turned away from the absorbing scenes pictured upon the visiplate and faced his 2 companions. "But what can we possibly do?" asked Clio. "Whatever it is, we'll try it," Bradley exclaimed. "Anything's better than staying here and letting them analyze us. No telling what they'd do to us," Costigan went on. "I know a lot more about things than they think I do. They never did catch me using my spy ray. It's on an awfully narrow beam, you know, and uses almost no power at all. So I've been able to dope out quite a lot of stuff. I can open most of their locks, and I know how to run their small boats. This battle, fantastic as it is deadly stuff, and it isn't one-sided by any means either, so that every one of them, from Nerado down, seems to be on emergency duty. There are no guards watching us or stationed where we want to go. Our way is open. And once out, this battle is giving us our best possible chance to get away from them. There's so much emission out there already that they probably couldn't detect the driving force of the lifeboat, and they'll be too busy to chase us anyway. Once out, then what? Asked Bradley. We'll have to decide that before we start, of course. I'd say make a break back for Earth. We know the direction, and we'll have plenty of power. But, good heavens, Conway, it's so far, exclaimed Cleo. How about food, water, and air? Would we ever get there? You know as much about that as I do. I think so, but of course anything might happen. This ship is none too big, is considerably slower than the big spaceship, and we're a long ways from home. Another bad thing is the food question. The boat is well stocked according to Nevian ideas, but it's pretty foul stuff for us to eat. However, it's nourishing, and we'll have to eat it, since we can't carry enough of our own supplies to the boat to last long. Even so, we may have to go on short rations, but I think we'll be able to make it. On the other hand, what happens if we stay here? They will find us sooner or later, and we don't know any too much about these ultra-weapons. We are land-dwellers, and there is little, if any, land on this planet. Then, too, we don't know where to look for what land there may be, and even if we could find it, we know that it is all overrun with amphibians already. There's a lot of things that might be better, but they might be a lot worse, too. How about it? Do we try, or do we stay here? We try it, exclaimed Cleo and Bradley as one. All right, I'd better not waste any more time talking. Let's go. Stepping up to the locked and shielded door, he took out a peculiarly built torch and pointed it at the Nevian lock. There was no light, no noise, but the massive portal swung smoothly open. They stepped out, and Costigan relocked and re-shielded the entrance. How? What? Cleo demanded. I've been going to school for the last few weeks, Costigan grinned, and I've picked up quite a few things here and there, literally as well as figuratively. Snap it up, guys. Our armor is stored with the pieces of the pirate's lifeboat, and I'll feel a lot better when we've got it on and have hold of a few Lewistons. They hurried down corridors, up ramps, and along hallways, with Costigan's spy ray investigating the course ahead for chance Nevians. Bradley and Cleo were unarmed, but the operative had found a piece of flat metal and had ground it to a razor edge. I think I can throw this thing straight enough and fast enough to chop off a Nevian's head before he can put a paralyzing ray on us, he explained grimly, but he was not called upon to show his skill with the improvised cleaver. As he had concluded from his careful survey, every Nevian was at some control or weapon, doing his part in that frightful combat with the denizens of the greater deeps. Their path was open. They were neither molested nor detected as they ran toward the compartment within which was sealed all their belongings. The door of that room opened, as had the other, to Costigan's knowing beam, and all three set hastily to work. They made up packs of food, filled their capacious pockets with emergency rations, buckled on Lewistons and automatics, donned their armor, and clamped into their external holsters a full complement of additional weapons. Now comes the ticklish part of the business, Costigan informed the others. His helmet was slowly turning this way and that, and the others knew that through his spy ray goggles he was studying their route. There's only one boat we stand a chance of reaching, and somebody's mighty apt to see us. There's a lot of detectors up there, and we'll have to cross a corridor full of communicator beams. There, that line's off. Scoot. At his word, they dashed out into the hall and hurried along for minutes, dodging sharply to right or left as the leader snapped out orders. Finally, he stopped. Here's those beams I told you about. We'll have to roll under 'em. They're less than waist high. Right there's the lowest one. Watch me do it, and when I give the word, one at a time, you do the same. Keep low. Don't let an arm or leg get up into the ray, or they may see us. He threw himself flat, rolled upon the floor a yard or so, and scrambled to his feet. He gazed intently at the blank wall for a space. Bradley, now, he snapped, and the captain duplicated his performance. But Cleo, unused to the heavy and cumbersome space armor she was wearing, could not roll in it with any degree of success. When Costigan barked his order, she tried, but stopped, floundering almost directly below the network of invisible beams. As she struggled, one mailed arm went up, and Costigan saw in his ultra-goggles the faint flash as the beam encountered the interfering field. But already he had acted. Crouching low, he struck down the arm, seized it, and dragged the girl out of the zone of visibility. Then, in furious haste, he opened the nearby door, and all three sprang into a tiny compartment. "Shut off all the fields of your suits so that they can't interfere," he hissed into the utter darkness. "Not that I'd mind killing a few of these, but if they start an organized search, we're sunk. But even if they did get a warning by touching your glove, Cleo, they probably won't suspect us. Our rooms are still shielded, and the chances are that they're too busy to bother much about us anyway." He was right. A few beams darted here and there, but the Nevians saw nothing amiss and ascribed the interference to the falling into the beam of some chance bit of charged metal. With no further misadventures, the fugitives gained entrance to the Nevian lifeboat, where Costigan's first act was to disconnect one steel boot from his armor of space. With a sigh of relief, he pulled his foot out of it, and from it carefully poured into the small power tank of the craft fully 30 pounds of allotropic iron. "I pinched it off them," he explained, in answer to amazed and inquiring looks. "And maybe you don't think it's a relief to get it out of that boot. I couldn't steal a flask to carry it in, so this was the only place I could put it. These lifeboats are equipped with only a couple of grams of iron apiece, you know, and we couldn't get halfway back to Tellus on that, even with smooth going, and we may have to fight. With this much to go on, though, we could go on to Andromeda fighting all the way. Well, we'd better break away." Costigan watched his plate closely, and when the maneuvering of the great vessel brought his exit port as far away as possible from the third city and its warring tanks, he shot the little cruiser out and away. Straight out into the ocean it sped, through the murky red veil, and darted upward toward the surface. The three wanderers sat tense, hardly daring to breathe, staring into the plates. Cleo and Bradley pushing at mental levers and stepping down hard upon mental brakes in unconscious efforts to help Costigan dodge the beams and rods of death flashing so appallingly close upon all sides. Out of the water and into the air the darting, dodging lifeboat flashed in safety. But in the air, supposedly free from menace, came disaster. There was a crunching, grating shock, and the vessel was thrown into a dizzy spiral from which Costigan finally leveled it into headlong flight away from the scene of battle. Watching the pyrometers which recorded the temperature of the outer shell, he drove the lifeboat ahead at the highest safe atmospheric speed while Bradley went to inspect the damage. "Pretty bad, but better than I thought," the captain reported. "Outer and inner plates broken away on a seam. We couldn't hold cotton waste, let alone air. Any tools aboard?" "Some, and what we haven't got, we'll make," Costigan declared. "We'll put a lot of distance between us, then we'll fix her up and get away from here." "What are those fish anyway, Conway?" Cleo asked, as the lifeboat tore along. "The Nevians are bad enough, heaven knows, but the very idea of intelligent and educated fish is enough to drive one mad. You know, Narado mentioned several times the semi-civilized fishes of the greater deeps," he reminded her. "I gather that there are at least 3 intelligent races here. We know 2, the Nevians, who are amphibians, and the fishes of the greater deeps. The fishes of the lesser deeps are also intelligent. As I get it, the Nevian cities were originally built in very shallow water, or perhaps were upon islands. The development of machinery and tools gave them a big edge on the fish, and those living in the shallow seas nearest the islands gradually became tributary nations, if not actually slaves. Those fish not only serve as food, but work in the mines, hatcheries, and plantations, and do all kinds of work for the Nevians. Those so-called lesser deeps were conquered first, of course, and all their races of fish are docile enough now, but the deep-sea breeds, who live in water so deep that the Nevians can hardly stand the pressure down there, were more intelligent to start with, and more stubborn besides. But the most valuable metals here are deep down. This planet is very light for its size, you know. So the Nevians kept at it until they conquered some of the deep-sea fish, too, and put 'em to work. But those high-pressure boys were nobody's fools. They realized that as time went on, the amphibians would get further and further ahead of them in development, so they let themselves be conquered, learned how to use the Nevians' tools and everything else they could get hold of, developed a lot of new stuff on their own, and now they're out to wipe the amphibians off the map completely before they get too far ahead of them to handle. "And the Nevians are afraid of them, and want to kill them all as fast as they possibly can?" guessed Cleo. "That would be the logical thing, of course," commented Bradley. "Got pretty nearly enough distance now, Costigan?" "There isn't enough distance on the planet to suit me," Costigan replied. "We'll need all we can get. A full diameter away from that crew of amphibians is too close for comfort. Their detectors are keen." "Then they can detect us?" Cleo asked. "Oh, I wish they hadn't hit us. We'd have been away from here long ago." "So do I," Costigan agreed feelingly. "But they did. No use squawking. We can rivet and weld those seams, and things could be a lot worse. We are still breathing air." In silence, the lifeboat flashed onward, and half of Nevia's mighty globe was traversed before it was brought to a halt. Then, in furious haste, the two officers set to work again to make their small craft sound and spaceworthy. End of Chapter 11. Triplanetary, first in the Lensman series by E. Doc Smith. Chapter 12, Worm, Submarine, and Freedom. Since both Costigan and Bradley had often watched their captors at work during the long voyage from the solar system to Nevia, they were quite familiar with the machine tools of the amphibians. Their stolen lifeboat, being an emergency craft, of course carried full repair equipment, and to such good purpose did the two officers labor that even before their air tanks were fully charged, all the damage had been repaired. The lifeboat lay motionless upon the mirror-smooth surface of the ocean. Captain Bradley had opened the upper port, and the three stood in the opening, gazing in silence toward the incredibly distant horizon, while powerful pumps were forcing the last possible ounces of air into the storage cylinders. Mile upon strangely flat mile stretched that waveless, unbroken expanse of water, merging finally into the violent redness of the Nevian sky. The sun was setting, a vast ball of purple flame dropping rapidly toward the horizon. Darkness came suddenly as that seething ball disappeared, and the air became bitterly cold in contrast to the pleasant warmth of a moment before. And as suddenly, clouds appeared in blacky, banked masses, and a cold, driving rain began to beat down. "Brr, it's cold. Let's go in. Oh, shut the door!" Clio shrieked, and leaped wildly down into the compartment below, out of Costigan's way, for he and Bradley had also seen, slithering toward them, the frightful arm of the Thing. Almost before the girl had spoken, Costigan had leaped to the controls, and not an instant too soon, for the tip of that horrible tentacle flashed into the rapidly narrowing crack just before the door clanged shut. As the powerful toggles forced the heavy wedges into engagement and drove the massive disk home, that grisly tip fell severed to the floor of the compartment, and lay there twitching and writhing with a loathsome and unearthly vigor. 2 feet long the piece was, and larger than a strong man's leg. It was armed with spiked and jointed metallic scales, and instead of sucking discs, it was equipped with a series of mouths filled with sharp metallic teeth which gnashed and ground together furiously, even though sundered from the horrible organism which they were designed to feed. The little submarine shuddered in every plate and member as monstrous coils encircled her and tightened inexorably in terrific, rippling surges eloquent of mastodonic power, and a strident vibration smote sickeningly upon terrestrial eardrums as the metal spikes of the monstrosity crunched and ground upon the outer plating of their small vessel. Costigan stood unmoved at the plate, watching intently, hands ready upon the controls. Due to the artificial gravity of the lifeboat, it seemed perfectly stationary to its occupants. Only the weird gyrations of the pictures upon the lookout screens showed that the craft was being shaken and thrown about like a rat in the jaws of a terrier. Only the gauges revealed that they were almost a mile below the surface of the ocean already, and were still going downward at an appalling rate. Finally, Clio could stand no more. "Aren't you going to do something, Conway?" she cried. "Not unless I have to," he replied composedly. "I don't believe that he can really hurt us, and if I use force of any kind I'm afraid that will kick up enough disturbance to bring Nerado down on us like a hawk onto a chicken. However, if he takes us much deeper, I'll have to go to work on him. We're getting down pretty close to our limit, and the bottom's a long way down yet." Deeper and deeper the lifeboat was dragged by its dreadful opponent, whose spiked teeth still tore savagely at the tough outer plating of the craft, until Costigan reluctantly threw in his power switches. Against the full propellant thrust the monster could draw them no lower, but neither could the lifeboat make any headway toward the surface. The pilot then turned on his beams, but found that they were ineffective. So closely was the creature wrapped around the submarine that his weapons could not be brought to bear upon it. "What can it possibly be, anyway, and what can we do about it?" Clio asked. "I thought at first it was something like a devilfish, or possibly an overgrown starfish, but it isn't," Costigan made answer. "It must be a kind of flatworm. That doesn't sound reasonable. That thing must be all of 100 meters long. But there it is. The only thing left to do that I can think of is to try to boil him alive. He closed other circuits, diffusing a terrific beam of pure heat, and the water all around them burst into furious clouds of steam. The boat leaped upwards as the metallic fins of the gigantic worm fanned vapor instead of water, but the creature neither released its hold nor ceased its relentlessly grinding attack. Minute after minute went by, but finally the worm dropped limply away, cooked through and through, vanquished only by death. "Now we've put our foot in it, clear to the neck," Costigan exclaimed, as he shot the lifeboat upward at its maximum power. "Look at that! I knew that Nerado could trace us, but I didn't have any idea that they could." Staring with Costigan into the plate, Bradley and the girls saw, not the Nevian sky rover they had expected, but a fast submarine cruiser manned by the frightful fishes of the greater deeps. It was coming directly toward the lifeboat, and even as Costigan hurled the little vessel off at an angle and then sped upward into the air, one of the deadly offensive rods, tipped with its glowing ball of pure destruction, flashed through the spot where they would have been had they held their former course. But powerful as were the propellant forces of the lifeboat, and fiercely though Costigan applied them, the denizens of the deep clamped a tractor beam upon the flying vessel before it had gained a mile of altitude. Costigan aligned his every driving projector as his vessel came to an abrupt halt in the invisible grip of the beam, then experimented with various dials. "There ought to be some way of cutting that beam," he pondered audibly, "but I don't know enough about their system to do it, and I'm afraid to monkey around with things too much, because I might accidentally release the screens we've already got out, and they're stopping altogether too much stuff for us to do without them right now." He frowned as he studied the flaring defensive screens, now radiating an incandescent violet under the concentration of forces being hurled against them by the warlike fishes, then stiffened suddenly. "I thought so! They can shoot 'em!" he exclaimed, throwing the lifeboat into a furious corkscrew turn, and the very air blazed into flaming splendor as a dazzlingly scintillating ball of energy sped past them and high into the air beyond. Then, for minutes, a spectacular battle raged. The twisting, turning, leaping airship, small as she was and agile, kept on eluding the explosive projectiles of the fishes, and her screens neutralized and re-radiated the full power of the attacking beams. More, since Costigan did not need to think of sparing his iron. The ocean around the great submarine began furiously to boil under the full-driven offensive beams of the tiny Nevian ship. But escape Costigan could not. He could not cut that tractor beam, and the utmost power of his drivers could not wrest the lifeboat from its tenacious clutch. And slowly but inexorably the ship of space was being drawn downward toward the ship of ocean's depths. Downward, in spite of the utmost possible effort of every projector and generator. And Clio and Bradley, sick at heart, looked once at each other. Then they looked at Costigan, who, jaw hard set and eyes unflinchingly upon his plate, was concentrating his attack upon one turret of the green monster as they settled lower and lower. If our number is going up, Conway," Clio began unsteadily. "Not yet, it isn't," he snapped. "Keep a stiff upper lip, girl. We're still breathing air, and the battle's not over yet." Nor was it. But it was not Costigan's efforts, mighty though they were, that ended the attack of the fishes of the greater deeps. The tractor beams snapped without warning, and so prodigious were the forces being exerted by the lifeboat that as it hurled itself away, the three passengers were thrown violently to the floor, in spite of the powerful gravity controls. Scrambling up on hands and knees, bracing himself as best as he could against the terrific forces, Costigan managed, finally, to force a hand up to his panel. He was barely in time, for even as he cut the driving power to its normal value, the outer shell of the lifeboat was blazing at white heat from the friction of the atmosphere through which it had been tearing with such an insane acceleration. "Oh, I see. Nerado to the rescue," Costigan commented, after a glance into the plate. "I hope that those fish blow him clear out of the galaxy." "Why?" demanded Clio. "I should think that you'd—" "Think again," he advised her. "The worse Nerado gets licked, the better for us. I don't really expect that, but if they can keep him busy long enough, we can get far enough away so that he won't bother about us any more." As the lifeboat tore upward through the air at the highest permissible atmospheric velocity, Bradley and Clio peered over Costigan's shoulders into the plate, watching in fascinated interest the scene which was being kept in focus upon it. The Nevian ship of space was plunging downward in a long slanting dive, her terrific beams of force screaming out ahead of her. The beams of the little lifeboat had boiled the waters of the ocean. Those of the parent craft seemed literally to blast them out of existence. All about the green submarine there had been volumes of furiously boiling water and dense clouds of vapor. Now water and fog alike disappeared, converted into transparent, superheated steam by the blasts of Nevian energy. Through that tenuous gas the enormous mass of the submarine fell like a plummet, her defensive screens flaming an almost invisible violet, her every offensive weapon vomiting forth solid and vibratory destruction toward the Nevian cruiser so high in the angry, scarlet heavens. For miles the submarine dropped, until the frightful pressure of the depth drove water into Nerado's beam faster than his forces could volatilize it. Then, in that seething funnel, there was waged a starkly fantastic conflict. At its wildly turbulent bottom lay the submarine, now apparently trying to escape, but held fast by the tractors of the spaceship. At its top, smothered almost to the point of invisibility by billowing masses of steam, hung poised the Nevian cruiser. As the atmosphere had grown thinner and thinner with increasing altitude, Costigan had regulated his velocity accordingly, keeping the outer shell of the vessel at the highest temperature consistent with safety. Now, beyond measurable atmospheric pressure, the shell cooled rapidly, and he applied full touring acceleration. At an appalling and constantly increasing speed, the miniature spaceship shot away from the strange red planet, and smaller upon the plate became its picture. The great vessel of the void had long since plunged beneath the surface of the sea to come more closely to grips with the vessel of the fishes. For a long time nothing of the battle had been visible, save immense clouds of steam blanketing hundreds of square miles of the ocean's surface. But just before the picture became too small to reveal details, a few tiny dark spots appeared above the banks of cloud, now brilliantly illuminated by the rays of the rising sun, dots which might have been fragments of either vessel, blown bodily from the depths of the ocean, and riven asunder, hurled high into the air by the incredible forces at the command of the other. Nevia, a tiny moon, and the fierce blue sun rapidly growing smaller in the distance. Costigan swung his Visi-ray beam into the line of travel and turned to his companions. "Well, we're off," he said, scowling. "I hope it was Nerado that got blown up back there, but I'm afraid it wasn't. He whipped 2 of those submarines that we know of, and probably half their fleet besides. There's no particular reason why that one should be able to take him, so it's my idea that we should get ready for great gobs of trouble. They'll chase us, of course, and I'm afraid that with their power they'll catch us." "But what can we do, Conway?" asked Clio. "Several things," he grinned. "I managed to get quite a lot of dope on that paralyzing ray, and some of their other stuff, and we can install the necessary equipment in our suits easily enough." They removed their armor, and Costigan explained in detail the changes which must be made in the Triplanetary field generators. All 3 set vigorously to work, the 2 officers deftly and surely, Clio uncertainly and with many questions, but with undaunted spirit. Finally, having done everything they could do to strengthen their position, they settled down to the watchful routine of the flight, with every possible instrument set to detect the sign of the pursuit they so feared. End of Chapter 12.